Alright, so this lecture has some highlights on the history of the English language. This is part of our study of the medieval period in world history, as well as so this lecture contains some highlights on the history of the English language. And from this lecture I want you to understand the role of Latin and Greek in English. I think this will also help you understand why English spelling is so weird. But most importantly, I want you to use this knowledge to improve your vocabulary skills for reading. If you can break apart words and recognize their roots and their prefixes and suffixes, you're going to understand those words a lot better. It's going to be easier for you to learn new words and grow your vocabulary. And ultimately, you're just going to be a better reader and writer and speaker and listener of English. So let's begin. Let's look at the history of England before the Romans, right? If you've watched the Anglo-Saxon Literature lesson, watched the Anglo-Saxon Literature lecture, or completed the Anglo-Saxon Literature lesson, you know that there were Celtic peoples who inhabited the British Isles before the Romans invaded. And their languages still survive, but they don't influence English very much. I mean, there are some words from the older Celtic languages in English, but they're rare. Right? And so the first Roman expeditions into Britain were under Julius Caesar in 55 BCE. And the first real conquest began in 43 BCE, the year after Caesar's assassination. And as you know, Roman rule in Britain lasted until the fall of Rome in 476 CE. And so after the Romans left, Latin, which was the language of the Romans, didn't really become part of the language of the people in Britain. I mean, there are some words that went into the languages of those people, but primarily Latin was the language of the church and of the Roman soldiers and the Roman bureaucrats who ran the government under the Romans, but they weren't really the language of the people. So after the Romans left, the language disappeared from Britain, except for monasteries and churches, and probably smaller pockets in the larger cities. But out in the countryside, Latin was not the language of the people. It was really the Anglo-Saxon invasions, let's back up to this other slide, it was really the languages of the Anglo-Saxons that had the first lasting impact on English. And so if we look at this map here, we see these different tribes coming from Western Europe and Scandinavia into England. These are the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. And remember from the Anglo-Saxon lecture, right, the name for the tribe, Angles, becomes Anglish, right, England, right, England is the land of the Angles. And so we can see just from the very name itself that these tribes began to have a lasting impact on our language. And during the Dark Ages, the Celtic languages returned to a wider use, but the Anglo-Saxon invasions brought the Germanic languages into Britain. Right? As we can see from this kind of language family tree, German is Germanic is one of the ancestor languages of English. Right? We can see this family tree of languages here that branches out into the North Germanic languages. These are the Scandinavian tongues. The East Germanic languages, which is Gothic, and those East Germanic regions were taken over by the Slavs, and so that language kind of died off in the face of Russian and the languages of those people. And then the West Germanic languages, which become German and Yiddish. Remember, Yiddish is the language of the Jews in this region. Yiddish is kind of a mix of Hebrew and German. And then the other West German languages, which includes English, right? So we call the language of this period Old English. And we'll listen to some selections in Old English in class. To my ears, Old English sounds a lot more like Norwegian and Danish, and I think you're going to hear that as well. However, the big change is in 1066 under the Norman invasions, right? If you remember at the end of the Anglo-Saxon lecture, I talked very briefly about the Norman invasions, and you were probably looking at that slide wondering why it mattered and why it was maybe even in that lecture. Here's the connection, right? In 1066, William, who was Duke of Normandy, Normandy is a region of France, led an army into Britain to claim the throne of England, which was disputed after the death of Edward the Confessor, right? He dies childless. And so William, as well as a few other people, claim the English throne. William succeeds. Now, William's a French duke, right? And so French becomes the official language of England, right? And as we look back at the history of Europe, the English and French hate each other, right? It's only a feature of the 20th century that the English and French are friends and building tunnels to each other's country and things like that. The English and French hated each other. So for, French to be the official language of England is kind of funny. It would almost be like Russian being the official language of America in the middle 20th century. Remember that French is a daughter language of Latin, right? So if we look at this large family tree of the so-called Romance languages, the Romance languages are the languages that come out of Latin. As we kind of trace the family tree down here, we can see all the Romance languages, which, in our day and age are the languages of Romanian, Aromanian, which is a very small language, French, Occitan and Catalan, which are small dialects in the Iberian Peninsula, as well as Spanish and Portuguese and Italian, right? So French comes from Latin. And so therefore the two ancestor languages of English are Latin by way of French and German by way of the Anglo-Saxon languages. Again, however, French was only the language of government and international business. The Anglo-Saxon languages, and even sometimes the old Celtic languages, were still the languages of the people, and then you have Latin as the language of the church, and all this kind of mixes together to create English, right? English is a mutt language, and that is part of why English is so hard to spell, because you have spelling rules for words that come from Latin and French. You have different spelling rules for words that come from the Germanic languages. And as we're going to see, there are some different spelling rules for words that come from Greek. Finally, English, because the English went out and conquered so many parts of the world during the Renaissance and Enlightenment period, English is soaking up all these other words from other languages. For example, algebra is not an English word. Algebra is an Arabic word. And raccoon is not an English word. It's a Native American word. I don't recall what tribe or what Indian language family raccoon comes from, but that's not an English word either. And so English also soaks up all of these words. And so that's why English is, by most people's count, the biggest language in the world in terms of number of words. It's also the most confusing language in the world because, again, of its varied history. But it's a mutt language. Very, very mixed up. Right, so the next major period in the development of English is the 100 Years' War. Beginning, and it really wasn't a 100-year-long war, beginning in the 1300s, England and France have this series of smaller wars that we just kind of roll together and call the 100 Years' War. It's actually only about 120 years. I'm sorry, it was actually 120 years long. And during this time, the English people started to reject all things French, including their language. And so the language of politics and business in England starts to shift away from French. And this period is the beginning of what we now call the Middle English period. Right? I mean, we have Old English, we have Middle English. We speak modern English. right? Middle English sounds much more like modern English, but it was before the Great Vowel Shift. And the Great Vowel Shift is kind of an interesting feature. It was, the changing of the pronunciation of vowels, especially the E at the ends of words, right? I mean, when we learn to spell as, kindergartners and first and second graders in this country, we learn about the silent E. And we always, why on earth? Traditionally, that E was not silent, right? So a word like trade was pronounced trada, right? And a word like maid was pronounced mad, right? And love would be pronounced something like luva, right? So we once did pronounce that E, but the Great Vowel Shift, is a shift in pronunciation. So towards the end of the medieval period, in the Renaissance, we start to get modern English, right? So once the Great Vowel Shift is done, we start to shift into what we call modern English, right? Shakespeare wrote in modern English. English teachers always get a little bit cranky when kids say, I don't understand Shakespeare, it was in Old English. It's not Old English. Shakespeare wrote in poetry, and so that's why Shakespeare is so hard to understand. And when you watch the background lecture for Othello, I'm going to talk more about that. Shakespeare did not write in Old English, he wrote in modern English. And so the Renaissance, which was a period in England, right? I mean, the Renaissance took place throughout Europe. And so when I talk about the Renaissance here, I'm talking primarily about the English Renaissance. The word itself means rebirth, right? And the Renaissance was a rebirth of classical learning from the Greeks and the Romans, especially their reading and writing, right? And so at this time, a lot of Greek and Latin words start to come into English, especially in literature and the sciences. And so it's kind of a funny thing, right? Once the Romans leave England, Latin kind of goes away, but it comes back in the Renaissance. And again, we also get all these Greek words, especially in science. And so that's why we'll have words that have PH making an F sound. And again, I mean, English is a mutt language, and so again, this helps explain some of the spelling. In fact, most of what we consider hard words come from Latin and Greek, and so a word like maladaptive, which means that you can't adjust to things properly or you can't do things properly, maladaptive comes from Latin, right? If you speak Spanish or French, you recognize the word mala, or mal, which just means bad, right? Or a word like physiology, which comes from Greek. Again, that kind of funky PH spelling. The easy words in English, right? Words like the, or and house, those tend to come from the Germanic side. So usually English speakers consider a word like wife to be an easy word, right? Whereas spouse, right, which, if you speak Spanish, right, esposa, spouse is a fancy word, right? If I call my wife my spouse, everybody thinks I'm trying to be fancy. If I call her my wife, and yeah, it's his wife, right? So it's an interesting feature. The next period in the development of English is the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was a period from the 1600s to the 1800s, and this was a period of great scientific and philosophical advancement in Europe. And it was at this time that the first dictionaries were produced, and English spelling began to become standardized and locked into place. We have an account of the great English writer Edmund Spenser. In various places, Spenser spelled his name differently. His own name, he spelled his own name differently in different documents. And that's because to somebody like Spenser living in the Renaissance, you just spell things how they sound. But in the Enlightenment, right, this great rage of science and order, and we're going to make everything standardized, spelling in English began to become fixed, right? Before the Enlightenment, it was a great time to be dyslexic. I mean, it's almost like everybody was dyslexic. But after the Enlightenment, there's only one way to spell cat. There's only one way to spell house, and it has that weird silent E at the end. Okay, so what? Why does this matter, right? I mean, this matters because it affects our vocabulary and spelling. If you've ever watched those, national spelling bees on TV, which you should, or if you've ever watched a movie like Aquila and the Bee, which is a great movie. I mean, I love watching that with my kids. You'll notice that those kids on those spelling bees will ask about the origin of a word, and they'll say, "Oh, it's a Greek word," or "It's an Arabic word." Those word histories affect the spelling of words. It also affects our vocabulary. So in this project, and for the rest of the year this year, we're going to work on recognizing key Greek and Latin roots, because this is going to help you read and write and spell those hard words more effectively. This is also going to help you in your science courses, especially biology and physics, and chemistry too. This also helps explain why Spanish speakers are lucky, right? Traditionally, English and American school children learned Latin, right? If our high school, was a high school in the 1800s, you guys would all be studying Latin as your foreign language, because it was thought that it would help you understand English better. It would also help you understand older European texts and the Bible more effectively. But later on, schools shifted more towards French because it's a language that people actually speak and use. And in America, Spanish is also taught for many of the same reasons, especially if you live in the western United States. You'll see much more Spanish classes being offered. If you speak French or Spanish, you'll find it easier to learn the hard words in English if you can recognize those common roots from Latin that exist in both English and Spanish and French. So those of you who do speak Spanish, use your knowledge. It will help you become a better reader. And so that's it. Thanks for watching. And I want you to keep this lesson in mind when we go on to study the vocabulary attack protocol in class, because I'm going to expand on some of these ideas, especially root words and bases. So again, keep this lesson in mind. Don't forget it.